The Hidden Scrolls by Neil Asher Silberman. Christianity, Judaism, and the War for the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Hidden Scrolls. Neil Asher Silberman, an archaeologist and writer, studied under Yigal Yadin and worked for the Israel Department of Antiquities. He is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and is the author of Digging Forgotten Country and Between Past and Present. He lives in Connecticut. Also by Neil Asher Silberman, A Prophet from Amongst You, Between Past and Present, Digging Forgotten Country. Neil Asher Silberman, The Hidden Scrolls, Christianity, Judaism, and the War for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Arrow. Preface. This book will offer an alternative version of the Dead Sea Scrolls story. It will suggest that many of the hundreds of ancient Hebrew and Aramaic texts found in caves by the northwestern shores of the Dead Sea must not be read solely as purely religious writings, but also a powerful message of rage against empire, a direct and timeless challenge to the injustices and inequalities imposed by the powers that be. The context for this protest movement was political and economic, not only spiritual, throughout the first century of the Common Era. A growing proportion of the population of a small province of Judea joined in an ever more violent movement of resistance against the imperial rule of the world's only superpower, the Roman Empire. For Christians, this was the era of the missionary efforts of the early apostles. For Jews, it was the last period of ancient Jewish political and territorial autonomy, after which local synagogue worship replaced centralized temple sacrifice. Yet I will argue that the essential message of the Dead Sea Scroll reflects one of the most widespread of all the politico-religious movements of first century Judea, the revolutionary messianic faith of the elect of Israel, with its call to holy war against foreign conquerors and collaborators. Far from being the work of isolated otherworldly monks living in a desert monastery, as many scholars maintain, the scrolls give voice and authority to the aspirations of the forgotten majority of the Judeans who embarked on a risky, even suicidal, armed rebellion that raged on all 4 full years from 66 CE until the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70, and even then fitfully continuing until the fall of Masada in 74. Many of these ancient texts express the timeless dreams of a subject people who would no longer allow themselves to be brutally exploited, alienated, and dispossessed. As we have seen in our own times, the feverish apocalyptic visions of cultists, survivalists, and religious separatists, each with their own distinctive violent visions of Armageddon, an unshakable faith in the victory of light over darkness, and searing hatred for all whom they identify as sinners or traitors, can have a frightening impact on events in the here and now, not just in the world to come. Indeed, the angry message of the scrolls often seems eerily close to the chanted accusations of modern Islamic fundamentalists condemning seekers after smooth things among their most westernized coreligionists. They also have much in common with the tirades of modern cult leaders and born-again visionaries who bellow out condemnation for the fornication, idolatry, and moral pollution of these last days. For the last 45 years, the world's most respected scroll scholars have concentrated almost exclusively on the scroll's language and literary genres, without wanting to recognize, the radical message they contain. The apocalyptic literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls represents a long-lost yet authentic expression of the biblical religion, embodying messianic expectations shared by a large segments of the Judean population who rose in the ill-fated revolt against Rome. For centuries, the message of the scrolls was reinterpreted or was branded as heresy by both the rabbis and the early church fathers, who eventually established a modus vivendi with Rome, surviving through accommodation and compromise. The adherents of the revolutionary messianic movement were killed, enslaved, or scattered. Yet as this book will attempt to explain, the vast treasury of ancient texts from the caves in the Judean desert may provide us with a glimpse at the forgotten radical message that lies hidden at the heart of both Judaism and Christianity. This account of the discovery, interpretation, and struggle for the control of the Dead Sea Scrolls could never have been written without the valuable contributions of many people at every stage of the work. As will become evident in the chapters that follow, the main narrative of this book is based on extended conversations I conducted with some of the most important characters in the Dead Sea Scrolls story, all of whom patiently and graciously answered countless technical questions, shared with me private reminiscences, and offered their differing perspectives on the historical significance of the Qumran literature. Among these scholars, I owe special thanks to Professor Lawrence Schiffman of New York University for his generosity, enthusiasm, and kind invitation to attend Dead Sea Scrolls symposia in Philadelphia and New York, to Professor John Strugnell of Harvard University for sharing with me his incomparable knowledge of the personalities and historical turning points of the Scrolls project, and allowing me to read preliminary drafts of his own memoirs, and to Herschel Shanks, the founder and editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, who provided me with his own perspective on the latest developments in the scroll story and drew my attention to overlooked facets of the earlier history of the scrolls. Dr. Emil Puek of the École Biblique et Archéologique in Jerusalem generously took time from his busy schedule to accompany me to the Rockefeller Museum to examine and discuss some especially important Cave 4 manuscripts. Archbishop Athanasius Yeshu Samuel of the Syrian Orthodox Church of America and Canada, still an active and charismatic leader of his community, shared with me his reflections on the discovery that changed his life. My thanks also go to Director Amir Drury of the Israel Antiquities Authority, to Professor Emil Tov, Editor-in-Chief of the Dead Sea Scrolls Publication Project, and to Curator Megan Broshi of the Shrine of the Book. Last, but certainly not least, I want to express my gratitude to Professor Robert Eisenman of California State University, Long Beach, who discussed with me at length his historical hypotheses about the Qumran community and provided me with copies of documents and correspondence related to the struggle to gain open access to the unpublished Qumran texts. A full listing of the scholars I interviewed during my research can be found at the end of this book. My deepest thanks go to all of them, though of course none bears any responsibility for the opinions I express or the historical interpretations I have adopted in this book. Readers will note that I have made extensive use of extracts from the transcripts of many of these taped conversations in my reconstruction of the Dead Sea Scrolls story. In most cases, I have reproduced the speaker's words precisely as recorded. In only a very few instances have I made slight changes in the grammar or style to make the spoken word easily readable as printed texts. The bibliographical notes I have included at the end of the book serve a double purpose: to offer sources for further reading to general readers and to provide a general essay on the sources I have utilized in arriving at certain admittedly controversial historical conclusions. In the interest of keeping the bibliography useful to general readers, I have cited only a few works that are highly technical or have been published in obscure sources. For the fullest published bibliographies of Qumran studies, see Fitzmyer, The Dead Sea Scrolls, Major Publications and Tools for Study, and Tove, The Unpublished Qumran Text. In light of the accelerating pace of Qumran publication, however, many new bibliographical items are added every year, making published listings incomplete almost as soon as they appear. In most cases where I have quoted directly from the scrolls, I have utilized the English translations of Geza Vermes from his book, The Dead Sea Scrolls in English. The sources of other translated extracts can be found in the bibliographical notes. Readers should be aware that the words that appear between square brackets have been restored by the translator as likely reconstructions of words or phrases in damaged parts of the scroll. Words that appear between parentheses do not appear in the original text, but have been added for clarity of translation. Regarding chronological terminology, I have used the accepted neutral terms Common Era, CE, and Before the Common Era, BCE, in place of the traditional BC and AD, whose religious associations would be out of place. Finally, a word about the title. In late 1947, when Professor Elazar Lipa-Sukenik of the Hebrew University first recognized the importance of several ancient Hebrew manuscripts recently discovered by the Te'amara Bedouin in the Dead Sea region, he gave them the Hebrew name Megillat ha-Genuzot, the hidden or concealed scrolls, in his belief that the documents had been deposited in antiquity in a geniza or repository for worn or damaged sacred writings. The later adoption of the common name Dead Sea Scrolls for these ancient manuscripts removed the concept of intentional concealment. My choice of the title for this book is meant to re-emphasize the conscious action that led to the deposit of the scrolls in Qumran Cave 1. As in my previous book, I want to express my appreciation to Janet Amitai for her superb research assistance and continuing editorial advice and administrative support. My thanks also go to Susan Berman, who also helped me with early interviews and archival research. The staffs of the Sterling Memorial Library of Yale University and of the Yale Divinity School Library offered their usual efficient assistance. On my research trips to Jerusalem, I was helped greatly by the staff of the Israel Antiquities Authority, especially Ayalia Sussman, Director of Publications, Chief Curator Ruta Peled, and Dr. Ronnie Wright of the Department of Archives. Stephen Weinstock, friend and media guru, offered invaluable input and encouragement. And as always, Steve Horn served as my dependable historical, philosophical, and medical advisor. My incomparable literary agent, Carol Mann, has once again has earned my deepest respect, appreciation, and thanks. Working with copy editor Timothy Meyer at the Putnam Publishing Group has been a pleasure. I want to offer him my gratitude for a job excellently done. It is no exaggeration to say that this book would never have come to be, and certainly would never have reached its present form, without the constant encouragement and invaluable editorial insights of Jane Izey, publisher of Grosset Books. Any thanks I express here are not nearly enough to repay her fundamental contribution to this project. Lastly, I want to offer my love and appreciation to friends and family who showed their usual understanding to me during yet another season of intensive book writing, and to Ellen and Maya, who had to live with a husband and father who for months on end spoke of little but scrolls and scholars. I can only hope that this book, now finally finished, will justify their patience and continuing confidence in me. Neil Asher Silberman, Brantford, Connecticut, May 10th, 1994. The Hidden Scrolls. Chapter 1. Away in the Wilderness. Here is my vision. 2,000 years ago, in the desolated, devastated province of Judea, some faithful people whose precise number or names we can now never know made a gesture of astonishing faith and optimism to reach out to us across the centuries. The time was one of horror and suffering. The Roman 10th Legion clanking arrogantly across the countryside, raising high the loathsome symbol of the wild boar on their idolatrous battle standards, was systematically surrounding and conquering the last few strongholds of the Jewish revolt, unhesitatingly executing all who would offer resistance and condemning most of the survivors to a life of slavery. Compliant Jewish priests, turncoats, and collaborators were settled by the Romans in specially designated towns and villages, places that we might today call re-education camps. At the same time, tens of thousands of Judeans who had surrendered or been captured in earlier operations were even now being concentrated in Mediterranean port cities to be sold in the slave markets of Crete, Ostia, Ephesus, and Sardinia as prostitutes, mine workers, or human fodder for the wild animal shows. The Holy Temple in Jerusalem, once the heart of the nation and the scattered people of Israel, lay in smoking ruins. The city of Jerusalem, embellished as the crowning jewel of Herod's kingdom, was now a stinking, charred quarry and graveyard through which only wild dogs and human scavengers roamed. But down by the shore of the Dead Sea, in the silence of the wilderness, far from the cities and camps of the occupying power, some surviving Jews proved that they had not abandoned their faith, that God would someday wreak his holy vengeance on the Romans, on the Jewish collaborators, and indeed on all the wicked people of the world. Gathering together some precious scrolls of scriptures, hymns, and prophecies of the coming day of judgment, he, she, or they carefully wrapped them in linen fabric. One of the pieces was embroidered with the symmetrical plan of the ideal Israelite temple, and placed them for safekeeping in tall pottery jars. The path up to the cliffside was steep and rocky. The tall jars in which the scrolls were placed were heavy, but this was a mission of faith. High above the destroyed settlement of Sakaka was a natural cleft in the hard brown limestone, one of hundreds of natural caves in the cliff's face, which the settlers here had used for decades as living places, hiding places, and genizot, or sanctified places for the disposal of damaged or worn-out religious texts. This particular cave was deep and narrow. Fragments of biblical books and mystical speculation, worn-out leather phylactery cases, and broken pottery lay scattered on the dirt floor of the cave. But this deposit was not meant as a routine, reverent disposal. It was a bold testimonial of religious identity and belief, with perfect faith that someday people would return to this place and find the scroll jars, and that those people would be able to read their impassioned message. The anonymous survivors of the great war between the Jews and the Romans left their precious documents inside the narrow cave. The documents they bequeathed to the future had been carefully selected from the hundreds of texts that had been written, read, and studied by the members of this community. There was the book of Isaiah with its vision of sin, suffering, and the divine redemption of the people of Israel. There was a copy of the law code by which the community had maintained its sanctity during the time of ever-deepening troubles by voluntarily separating itself from the men of falsehood and faithfully walking in the way of light. There were the penitential psalms written by the community's leader, the teacher of righteousness, declaring gratitude to God for personal salvation and for the sure knowledge that the wicked would, in the end, be destroyed for their sins. And there was the rule of war on the unleashing of the attack of the sons of light against the company of the sons of darkness, the army of Belial, a scroll of detailed instructions for the conduct of the final decisive holy war to be waged at the end of times. Among the other documents left for the future was a poignant commentary on the book of Habakkuk, in which the horrible events of these recent days of Roman sacrilege and genocide were explained as the fulfillment of the oracles of the ancient prophet, and a sure sign that divine vengeance was coming, even if its advent would be painfully delayed. On the day of judgment, the last line of the text read, "God will destroy from the earth all idolatrous and wicked men." Scattered here and there in the caves of a nearby cliffside were the traces of other Hebrew and Aramaic scripture, oracles, and testimonies, and they too were part of this community's legacy. They were scrolls and fragments of hundreds of works of law, oracles, poetry, and visions that had been buried, hidden, or borrowed by other members of this community over many decades. All these manuscripts, taken together, might be read as the recorded faith of a community of alienated, dispossessed Jewish priests and their followers who remained true to the strictest possible interpretation of the biblical laws. They also remained true to the hope for national redemption from the yoke of the people they called the Chapt, and we call the Romans, idolatrous invaders from across the sea, who trampled earth with their horses and beasts. Almost a century before, at about the time later gospel writers would place the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the spiritual founders of this community had established a wilderness camp here by the shore of the Salt Sea opposite the land of Moab, at a site they knew as Sakakah, the covered or the hidden, a place mentioned in the book of Joshua and given to the tribe of Judah as an eternal inheritance. At the time of the community's arrival, the place was just a ruin. But during the period of Judean political independence under the Maccabees, before the coming of the Romans, Sakaka had been an outpost of the Maccabean kingdom. And because this earlier occupants were faithful Maccabean soldiers and had apparently made an impression on travelers through the region, the cluster of buildings on the White Plateau overlooking the seashore was also known as the Fortress of the Pious Ones. Thus settling at this place with its scriptural and patriotic associations, the group numbering only a few dozen people who variously called themselves the community, the sons of Zadok, the elect, the poor, the way, and the sons of light, constructed their place of voluntary exile. They vowed to themselves and their God to make a way in the wilderness, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, to separate from the habitations of ungodly men, and play a central role in the terrifying events that were soon to engulf the world. A few years after their community was destroyed and their manuscripts hidden, the Jewish turncoat historian Josephus Flavius mistakenly, perhaps intentionally, described this priestly group and their lay followers throughout the country as the pious pacifist Essenes. But they were certainly not docile monks and mystics, no matter what Josephus said. They were to become the angry imams of their people, the rage-filled voice calling for resistance to the innovations and to the influence of the great Satan from the West. The great Satan was, of course, the Roman emperor, whose numberless agents, bureaucrats, enforcers, and stooges in Judea and throughout the Mediterranean had the blasphemous gall to declare their leader a son of God and Savior of all humanity. Of course, this Son of God and Savior was just a front man for a system of exploitation and conquest that made the metropolis of Rome an urban black hole of wealth and power, into which all the riches of its empire would eventually spin. Even in the relatively poor land of Judea, the effects of the New World Order were unmistakable, as small landholders, progressively forced into debt by taxation and natural disasters, were compelled to seek their livings as tenants, migratory workers, or day laborers in the rapidly expanding cities, and it was there that they came into contact, albeit at a respectful distance, with those Judeans, large landowners, high priests, successful merchants, and royal functionaries, who were happy to bow and scrape to the Romans in the name of profit and political moderation, and in the interest of what they called modernity. In fact, King Herod, ruling from 37 to 4 before the Common Era, BCE, had made a mockery of all the ancestral laws of the Covenant of Sinai by erecting magnificent temples to Augustus in Greek cities and by squandering his country's wealth in his lavish donations to the idolatrous Olympic Games. In Jerusalem, Herod's magnificent rebuilding of the Temple of God of Israel resulted in a spectacular structure which was, in its most authentic and spiritual essence, little more than an empty shell. Herodian princes and princesses swapped husbands, wives, and jockeyed for dynastic position. The high priest of the Temple of Jerusalem, appointed by Herod, were little more than manipulable yes-men from wealthy Jewish families of Egypt and Mesopotamia, servants more of the king than of God. Thus the three snares of Belial, the prince of darkness, riches, fornication, and defilement of the temple, had ensnared the high and the mighty of Jerusalem, which had itself become nothing more than a city of vanity. The rulers of the last of the Maccabean kings may have been self-serving and lacking on occasion appropriate piety, but Herod and his loathsome son Archelaus, both descended from Edomites who had been forcibly converted to Judaism, had destroyed all righteousness from the land. It was at this time of darkness that the sons of Zadok renewed habitation of the ruins of Sakaka. They restored the cisterns, watchtower, assembly rooms, and workshops built decades before under the patronage of the Maccabean kings, and after the death of Herod and the direct annexation of Judea to the Roman Empire, this small group enjoyed a fairly untroubled communal existence as far as we can tell, living far from the scenes of urban unrest and imperial regimentation. Down by the Dead Sea, they cultivated land that was apparently too parched and poor to be worth the trouble of the tax collectors. They raised flocks, gathered in holy assemblies, and produced their characteristic tools, pottery vessels, and literature of rage. As the times grew darker for their fellow Judeans, they looked forward ever more fervently to a glorious time of redemption to be ushered in by the appearance of God's Messiahs or anointed ones, who would bring justice and vengeance to the earth with their terrible swift swords. Though distinctive in their piety and communal discipline, the group that settled at Sakaka was part of a larger movement of national resistance. Though the historian Josephus Flavius, writing in luxurious surroundings in Rome about the events in Judea of this period, was always at pains to minimize the revolutionary tendencies of his people, his descriptions of the increasing unrest in Judea through the first century of the Common Era, CE, unwittingly betray the truth. His grim anecdotes of charismatic prophets and Messiah figures, public hysteria, and the customary cruel execution of would-be saviors in first-century Judea appear again and again. Simon, Ethronges, Judas, John the Baptist, Jesus of Nazareth, Theudas, and the mysterious Egyptian were just some of the leaders and preachers mentioned by Josephus who ended up beheaded or nailed to a cross. Under the rule of Roman officials with names like Pontius Pilate, Cuspius Fadus, Antonius Felix, and Decius Florus, the sons of Zadok may have been known as spiritual leaders, not recluses, adapting and elaborating ancient traditions of messianic fulfillment to the nation's aspirations for independence. They may have urged and promoted a subtle strategy of political non-collaboration through the ever stricter application of the traditional purity laws. Through the divine inspiration claimed by their teacher of righteousness, community members were given a glimpse of God's secret timetable for redemption, which could be checked against the terrifying, dislocating omens and events of their own times. And even after the teacher was persecuted and killed by the Jerusalem establishment, the community at Sakaka continued making their way in the wilderness, seeing in even their most painful misfortunes the unmistakable fulfillment of ancient prophecies. History has shown that this kind of gospel of rage against empire must at some point explode from silent anger to violent rebellion. And in that sense, the prophecies and admonitions of the sons of Zadok were translated into action with the eruption of a great national rebellion against the Roman Empire in 66 CE. The temple was purified of its quizzling priests, and the dutiful daily offering for the well-being of the emperor ceased. The long-expected holy war finally got underway as the Chapt brought their forces from the north and the south to wage war against God's people, and God's people arose to fulfill their destiny. But no Savior arose to lead the sons of light into battle. After a series of stunning military victories at the start of the rebellion, the Jewish independence movement degenerated into a bloody struggle for power between opposing, mock-pious warlords. The zealous gospel of redemption through absolute submission to God's law, not earthly power, was betrayed by the rebel leaders hungry for power. In time, God's enemies, the sons of darkness, conquered the land and laid waste to many cities. They leveled the city of Jerusalem and the luxurious villas where the Judean aristocrats had toasted their good fortune. The temple was destroyed, and the holy vessels, which were desecrated by the greedy grasp of the opposing rebel factions, were carried away to Rome, including the golden menorah. Yet even this holocaust and abomination of desolation were seen by some survivors as clear signs of God's power to punish the wicked. The real day of judgment could not be far away. Were it not for the scrolls left behind by the members of the community at Sakaka, we would never have had a glimpse of what it meant to be on the receiving end of Roman civilization, and to be determined to fight its encroachments with the weapons of tradition, no matter what the cost. Theirs is a voice from the wilderness, camp, the ghetto, and the barricade that even today points an accusing finger at all of us who see in ancient and modern empires only order, logic, and efficiency. They reveal in their passion and in their retreat into a reformulated fundamentalist tradition the anger of the people who refuse to become the raw material for other people's dreams. Yet the great irony was that in those later days dreamt of by the members of the community, when their precious scrolls would be recovered and opened, these writings would come into the possession of timid, straight-laced scribes who were skilled at deciphering ancient texts, parsing verbs, and distinguishing literary genres, but had absolutely no inclination to take the message of the scrolls seriously. The scholars' gilding creed was academic respectability, not resistance to unjust power. In their ivory towers and university campuses, these men, and very occasionally women, made careers for themselves, gave lectures, and slowly, very slowly, began to publish the contents of the scrolls. The message from the past had indeed been recovered, but in the process of translation, something powerful was lost. The Dead Sea Scrolls became a harmless public fascination, but their revolutionary passion and outrage against injustice had been consciously or unknowingly stripped from them. For many years, the Dead Sea Scrolls were for me just an innocent childhood fascination. The small reproduction clay scroll jar brought back from Israel by my grandfather in the late 1950s is an archaeological relic of my earliest interest in the scrolls. It still stands on my daughter Maya's night table among the snow globes and souvenir silver bells from colonial Williamsburg and Niagara Falls. Yet even now that souvenir jar evokes for me those childhood stories of Bedouin boys discovering an ancient treasure in the wilderness, which is probably as close to an authentic biblical vision as any child of the 1950s or 1960s was ever likely to get. In college in the late 1960s, as I began to study the Dead Sea Scrolls as an undergraduate student of the history of religion, I saw in the esoteric doctrines and apocalyptic poetry of the Dead Sea Scroll community an attractively iconoclastic contrast to the canonical books of the Old Testament. In the age of beings, sit-ins, and communes, I became fascinated by the faith of a group of deep desert recluses who had rejected the official worship of the Jerusalem temple and who focused all their hopes on the imminent cataclysmic end of the world. Yet now, as I look back, academic study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, all its superficial, mystical, and nonconformist associations notwithstanding, was really quite an unimaginative intellectual pursuit in those days. Even though 60s rebelliousness was creating upheaval and turmoil in so many scholarly disciplines, the conventional, non-political interpretation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as it had crystallized in the 1950s, remained largely unchallenged. No one except the handful of members of the official international team of editors knew the full extent of the documents of the Dead Sea Scroll collection, and the few texts known at the time were read as a purely religious doctrine, in a way that was hardly less canonical than the Bible itself. And when the time came for me to write a senior thesis on the Dead Sea sect's bizarrely fascinating interpretation of the book of Nahum, I too faithfully towed the party line. Like a faithful seminarian, I visited and briefly spoke with two of the leading scroll scholars, Professor Frank Moore-Cross at the Semitic Museum on the Harvard campus, and Professor John Strucknell at the Harvard Divinity School. There was almost a mystical quality, or maybe just a celebrity mystique, that seemed to cling to these men. They were among the small group of experts invited to Jordan in the early 50s who, with their own hands, had begun to piece together ancient texts from the thousands of parchment fragments recovered from the caves of Qumran. Occasionally, at scholarly conferences, they would offer tantalizing hints of future revelations from the large numbers of still unpublished documents. They were a powerful clique, an academic aristocracy, and few ever thought of questioning their authority. Indeed, their conventional interpretation of the scrolls themselves subtly reinforced the importance of conformity, not rebellion. From the enormous jigsaw puzzle of scroll fragments, Cross, Strugnell, and the others had crafted a saga fable of a self-righteous group of ancient Jewish pietists who were dedicated not in the time of Jesus, but at the time of the great Maccabean uprising around 165 BCE, to freeing Judea from the rule of the Seleucid Empire and the local Hellenized aristocracy. But seeing the Maccabean leadership eventually crown themselves kings of Judea and adopt Hellenistic trappings, so the standard explanation went, these religious rebels left Jerusalem around 125 BCE to establish a remote monastery in the wilderness where they could practice what they believed was the true biblical faith. What followed was a 2-century-long story of an isolated monastic community which was almost uniformly identified by scholars as a settlement, perhaps the main settlement, of the ancient Essenes, Although this group's doctrines and beliefs, as revealed in the scrolls, were superficially similar to those of early Christianity, in the prominence of messianism, dualism, baptism, and communal life, the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, so the scholars determined, represented little more than an evolutionary dead end. Father Joseph Milek of the Dominican École Biblique et Archéologique in Jerusalem, who was one of the most influential scroll editors, left no doubt as to his own religious allegiance when he summed up the ultimate impact of the scrolls in his 1959 book, 10 Years of Discovery in the Wilderness of Judea, which I had been assigned to read as an undergraduate text. Although Essenism bore in itself more than one element that one way or another fertilized the soil from which Christianity was to spring, Milek wrote, "It is nevertheless evident that the later religion represents something completely new which can only be adequately explained by the person of Jesus himself." The scroll's main significance was therefore perceived as an illustration of religious evolution. Most scholars saw the beliefs of the Essenes as expressed in the scrolls as religious insights that were slightly more advanced than mainstream Judaism, insights on the way as conceived in the simplistic terms of unlinear evolution to becoming Christianity. But it was not Christianity, just a brief aberration. It was a religious branch that bore no fruit, while waiting for the end of times and divinely aided triumph over the forces of darkness. The Dead Sea sect, so the standard explanation concluded, penned their scrolls, performed their ablutions, and remained serenely uninvolved in the turbulent politics of the times. Since the scholars directing the study had little interest in the connections between religious expression and political action, past or present, they could not imagine their ancient scroll writers lifting their heads from the tightly written lines of Hebrew scripture to contemplate or even react to the Roman oppression that was pressing down ever more heavily on their kinsmen and townsmen in all the places that they had left. And so the scholars explain that while the rest of Judean people eventually rose in revolt against the corrupt Roman administration, the scroll sect maintained its life of seclusion to the very end, like cloudy-headed intellectuals with tenure and therefore no need to worry about the present while contemplating the apocalyptic future. The Qumran Center was destroyed and its helpless members massacred when Vespasian's legions marched throughout the lower Jordan Valley in the spring of 68 CE. This story came to be gospel to all respectable biblical scholars and religious historians. For all their vividness, the scroll's specific end-of-the-world visions were seen as just so much feverish nonsense, like the get ready for Armageddon warnings of the door-to-door Jehovah's Witnesses missionaries in our own times, or the peasant revolts and public hysterias of medieval Europe. The fervor for the end of the world has always threatened and unsettled all sober, respectable citizens, and here the academic study of the Dead Sea Scrolls ironically provided a calm reassurance that these apocalyptic expectations were just a passing mania, significant only in their later transformation and universalization in the spiritual kingdom of God of established Christianity. In behavioral terms, the study of the scrolls was the opposite of the rage that filled the poetry and prophecy of the ancient documents. The scholar's discourse was civil, unemotional, analytical, and filled with the jargon of tweedy academics who were themselves voluntarily exiles from the rough and tumble of life beyond the ivy walls. I never questioned the traditional interpretations, even when I worked for the Israel Department of Antiquities in the early 1970s, when my interest shifted from the ancient texts to the archaeological finds. It was an exciting time to be involved in archaeology in Jerusalem. With the eastern part of the city conquered by Israel in 1967, excavations were underway throughout the Old City, vastly expanding our information about Jerusalem at the time of Jesus and the time of the Great Revolt against Rome. The massive toppled stones of the Herodian Temple and the charred remains of the wealthy villas in the upper city were the kinds of vivid reminders that were being daily revealed. And at the headquarters of the Israel Department of Antiquities, newly shifted to the stately Rockefeller Museum opposite the battlements of the old city, I came closer to the archaeology and secrets of the scrolls themselves. In the turreted white stone building that Herschel Shanks would later dub the Dead Sea Scrolls Prison was a basement labyrinth of storerooms and laboratories that held the greatest treasures of 50 years of Holy Land archaeology. Just off the main hallway of the basement level, with its walls lined with wooden shelves for disinterred ossuaries and sarcophagi of generations of ancient Jerusalemites, was the mysterious closed room where thousands of unpublished scroll fragments were stored in metal file drawers, pressed between glass plates. I remember the room's bone-chilling coldness, even in the midst of the raw and rainy Jerusalem winters, and I remember the eerie yellow light installed there to prevent the fading of the ancient manuscripts. But my memories were from fleeting glimpses through the half-open doorway, because even then only a small circuit of scholars appointed under Jordanian auspices was permitted free access to the Holy of Holies of the world of the Dead Sea Scrolls. For me, the archaeological finds from Qumran, the ancient site found near the Scrolls Caves, were far more evocative than the dark, crumpled pieces of inscribed leather on which the scholars continued to work. The archaeological finds from the site of Qumran, or as the French Dominican excavators preferred to call it, the Essene settlement, were arranged on shelves in a special storeroom. Here were the pots and pans and bowls and inkwells created and used by the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here were the bulky store jars smashed in antiquity, but now glued back together and arranged in rows. Here were the dozens of identical porridge bowls, each one carefully wrapped in yellow Jordanian newspaper, that were discovered in the pantry of the room that the excavators had identified as the monastery's refectory. Yet these finds remain mute and forgotten. The director of the excavations, Father Roland DeVoe, had not seriously dealt with this material after formulating his initial sweeping theories about the history of Qumran community. Promises of the eventual detailed publication of the finds were frequent and plentiful, but I never saw any other scholar in the storeroom, and the pottery simply collected dust. At the time, though, it hardly mattered, for the Qumran artifacts were not scientific evidence as much as they were sacred relics in the cult of the famous and ever-fascinating Dead Sea Scrolls. By the late 1980s, however, the peaceful silence of Qumran studies was broken. A highly publicized campaign to free the scrolls from the control of a small circle of scholars created an atmosphere of tension and suspicion and became an international cause célèbre. Supermarket tabloids and mass circulation dallies were usually concerned on sex, violence, and celebrity gossip. Now speculated on the possibility that explosive religious secrets lay among the unpublished Hebrew and Aramaic documents. Why else would they be kept unpublished for so long? And they reportedly contained secrets about the early history of Christianity and the Vatican, or alternatively, the government of Israel wanted permanently suppressed. The New York Times Time and Newsweek, meanwhile, pontificated on scholarly ethics, ancient Jewish messianism, and the history of first-century Judea with the self-important punditry that they use for matters of state. The public attention focused brightly on the scholars involved in the scroll story, sparked a series of soap opera-like sensations. After months of snipping and bickering with the rising chorus of protesters, many of whom were Jewish, the chief editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls Publication Project, an Oxford-trained Harvard professor named John Strugnell, gave an embarrassingly frank interview in 1990 in which he called Judaism a horrible religion and proudly defined himself as an anti-Judaist. In the inevitable public uproar, Strugnell was excoriated from pulpits and in angry editorials and was soon institutionalized for a severe bout with his manic depression and relieved of his official post. The walls of scholarly privilege had begun to crumble. After 45 years of control by an official publication team, large numbers of unpublished scroll fragments would soon be made available to all scholars. The Huntington Library in San Marino, California, unilaterally removed all restrictions on a duplicate set of scroll photographs it possessed. Professor Robert Eisenman of California State University at Long Beach, one of the most outspoken critics of the old order, was the first to pour through the precious microfilms. Herschel Shanks, crusading publisher of the Biblical Archaeology Review, who had spearheaded the campaign for free access to the scrolls, was hailed in the press and on television as a champion of the intellectual freedom. But in the academic community, among the respected scholars who had devoted their lives to the study of the scrolls, the outcome of the struggle was seen as a grave defeat. Shanks and Eisenman were seen as agents of chaos who had threatened the traditional scholarly pecking order. They had dared to challenge the deference that had always been accorded to those privileged few who were the official editors of the scrolls. Foolishly and mistakenly, I had never paid much attention to the Dead Sea Scrolls uproar. Whenever an archaeological sensation like the search for Noah's Ark, the existence of Atlantis, or the curse of Tutankhamun suddenly starts turning up in the pages of the supermarket tabloids between UFO sightings and celebrity diets, or starts popping up in angry made-for-TV shouting matches, I usually reach for the remote control. So I assumed that the three magic words, Dead Sea Scrolls, had merely become a media prop, just an empty symbol for ancient and mysterious. Everyone seemed to know vaguely what the Dead Sea Scrolls were, but hardly anyone had a clue about what they meant. Most people believed, and still believe, that they had something to do with Jesus, and almost everyone had gotten the impression that all the scrolls had been long suppressed. But none of this had any basis in reality as far as I understood it. So whenever a news story appeared about the suppression of the scrolls and the topic came up in casual conversation, I tended to ignore the whole thing. Some of it was due to hasty personal judgments. I had known Herschel Shanks for more than a decade as an enthusiastic and tireless promoter of his glossy, widely circulated Biblical Archaeology Review, and I suspected that his whole scrolls business was, for him, primarily a successful publicity campaign. As far as Robert Eisenman was concerned, I had met him briefly in the mid-1980s when I was living in Jerusalem, and there was something about the way that Eisenman portrayed himself as a despised outsider that initially rubbed me the wrong way. Eisenman's crusade to liberate the scrolls was later covered in the thickly perfumed pages of Vanity Fair and in the non-fiction thriller called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, a book that touted Eisenman's unorthodox theory of Dead Sea Scrolls origins. When I read through the book's dubious accusations of an Israeli Vatican conspiracy to suppress the scrolls, I dismissed both it and the value of Eisenman's historical theories. But at the time, with my opinion dulled by the old conventional story, I didn't realize how Eisenman's critique of the established scroll scholars was part of a far broader and more powerful challenge to the historical and spiritual authority of the Jewish and Christian religious establishments. Through 1992, while the national press was making hay out of the Dead Sea Scrolls story, Eisenman and a colleague, Michael Weiss, of the University of Chicago, were hard at work on their own translations and interpretations of 50 long restricted texts. They gave their book the most unscholarly title, The Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, adding to their transcription an implicit dig at the selfishness of the scholars who had kept those texts covered for so long. Eisenman and Weiss also added a no-holds-barred commentary that linked the Dead Sea Scrolls to rage, revolution, Jewish nationalism, and to the supposed secret militant roots of early Christianity. Most serious scroll scholars had disdainfully dismissed this radical interpretation and had by this time gotten their fill of Eisenman's arrogance, activism, and insolence. The 1992 New York Academy of Science Conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls was therefore destined to be the scene of the showdown in which 18 of the most respected scroll scholars in Israel, England, and America would try their best to silence or at least humiliate him. In an official statement signed by the scholars and faxed to newspapers and academic institutions all over the world, the Eisenman-Weiss book was branded as an insidious misrepresentation in its claims that it presented documents that had been withheld for over 35 years. The signatories now angrily claim that the significant number of the book's transcriptions were rehashes of previous publications or directly plagiarized. The statement went on with a list of damning charges of false claims, dishonesty, deception, and finally, in an ominous tone of high church orthodoxy, with the accusation that the volume abounds with errors and imprecisions in the transcription of the Hebrew and Aramaic documents and in the translating and interpreting of them. Every now and then, the drowsy boredom of academic conferences is dispelled by moments of high drama. The chairman of the opening session of the 1992 conference, Professor Eric Myers of Duke University, first read the contents of the letter from Jerusalem explaining the current policy of the Israel Antiquities Authority regarding the use of photographs of unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls fragments and explaining that the Eisenman-Weiss book was a clear violation of the rules. Then Professor Lawrence Schiffman of the New York University, a tall, black-bearded scholar and chosen spokesman of the accusers, read a long, passionate essay of indictment, complete with a list of apparent specific instances of plagiarism, with detailed bibliographical citations of each. In one particularly telling example, he demonstrated how the Eisenman-Weiss book reproduced another scholar's handwriting mistake. The verdict seemed already decided. Schiffman's final words were of ringing, outright condemnation, declaring that Eisenman and Weiss's behavior was a slight to serious scholars everywhere. Other statements followed, attempting to counter the charges. Professor James Robinson of the Ancient Biblical Manuscript Center sent in a statement calling for an end to the era of scholarly possessiveness. Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago, one of the conference organizers, suggested that the disciplinary charges were just a transparent cover for what amounted to an intellectual censorship. Next, Michael Weiss rose to present a polite and respectful refutation, going over all of the charges against him and Eisenman, one by one. But they all proved to be poor and unconvincing spokesmen for academic rebellion compared to Robert Eisenman. A stocky, combative figure, he had not been invited to sit on the stage with the main participants in the discussion, but stepped to the microphone set up in the aisle for comments from the audience. Everyone knew that he was the main target, and he rose to meet the challenge, his slight stutter repeatedly breaking through his rage. "The strangest thing here," Robert Eisenman observed sarcastically and angrily as he gripped the microphone and glared across the faces of the respectable scholars gathered before him, "is that I am always called idiosyncratic and a maverick. They all know very well that I don't read their works. I never read their works because I don't want my brain to get addled, quite frankly. I'm not invited to their conferences, and I don't get their handouts. And when I submit my papers to them, they don't publish them. So ethics or whatever," he continued with pointed, angry irony, "to hear that I have borrowed other people's works staggers me. Everybody in this room, everybody in the world knows that my theories don't resemble anyone's theories. I don't borrow from anybody, and that is the most preposterous accusation." You see, if you are going to dream up an accusation, you couldn't dream up a falser one, as far as I'm concerned. Eisenman then spoke with unembarrassed pride, not shame, of his recent book. "What is so thrilling to me personally," he insisted, "is to get to the point of being the first one out there with an interpretation. That's what I really loved about this volume. For the first time, we were going to be able to comment first. Because if you have been following my studies, you know that I have been saying all along that the editio principis and official edition also subtly slides in an official interpretation that to a docile and unsuspecting public becomes orthodoxy. And I have said that the reason I participated in the facsimile edition," he noted, referring to his earlier publication with Shanks and Robinson of scroll photographs without official authorization, "was to level the playing field, to get away from the official interpretations of the text, to let 1,000 voices sing. So when this chance came to be out there first with the 50 best documents from the unpublished corpus, something like that is how we privately described the kinds of things we were doing. Frankly, I felt that most of the material was unpublished. I was really astonished at Michael's publication notes. I thought he was very generous there. He gave credit beyond what any ordinary mortal should be called upon to do." Eisenman delighted in showing his impatience with the kinds of footnotes and attributions that so many mediocre scholars confuse with scholarship. For him, the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls was earth-shaking, revolutionary, not just a matter of respectfully reproducing the main conclusions of others with the addition perhaps of newly dotted I or a newly crossed T. What Eisenman was suggesting was both blasphemous and revolutionary, that both Christianity and Judaism, as we now know them, are fraudulent debasements of an earlier Messianic faith. He was convinced that both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism had survived and gained adherents primarily because they were systematically stripped of all the teachings of the earlier Jewish Messianic movement that questioned or threatened the status quo. Put simply, Eisenman was asking the world to look back and see that our understanding of the early history of Judaism and Christianity was a calculated misrepresentation fostered and disseminated by priests and rabbis willing to ensure their own survival through smarmy accommodation or even conspiracy with the powers that be. The Dead Sea Scrolls miraculously discovered after 2,000 years, offered modern scholars direct evidence of the events of New Testament times, untouched by the bonfires of the Inquisition or the ecclesiastical censor's pen. Yet the scholars failed to see what Eisenman did. What was staring them in the face, he later insisted to me, was the actual authentic messianic literature of Palestine. His voice tightened and his tone grew more angry. I never looked at anyone's work. I don't care about these people's work. I do not look at it in order to get inspiration. I go to the first sources. I'm interested in the principal sources. I consider Professor Schiffman's attack, I consider that a complete slander. He knows that very well. Yet Eisenman wanted to get to the heart of the matter, to move from a discussion of mere bibliographical matters to a discussion of religious history, for he was convinced that the 50 documents he and Weiss had published provided an indisputable evidence that the people of Qumran were the earliest Christians, that the scrolls represented the historical reality of a violent first-century nationalistic messianism that was subsequently systematically suppressed in the writings of the Church Fathers and by the sages of Rabbinic Judaism. One of the texts he and Weiss had published was a fragment of Hebrew poetry, listed officially as 4Q 285. The fragmentary text, only slightly bigger than a large postage stamp, referred to a messianic redeemer descended like Jesus from the Davidic line. Eisenman and Weiss had reconstructed the broken text to suggest that this messianic figure was distinguished by his suffering, pierced and ultimately slain by his enemies. When reported in the New York Times, this discovery caused a public sensation, for it was seen as the missing link between Judaism and Christianity. Some of the most prominent mainline scholars, adamant in their insistence that the Dead Sea sect and Christianity were quite different, convened a special seminar in Oxford and concluded that Eisenman and Weiss were in error. The text should be read that the Davidic Messiah would kill rather than be killed by his enemies. Eisenman, of course, realized that few scholars supported his identification of a Jesus-like character in the scrolls, but he was gratified that serious debate about the long secret text had been provoked. You know the public knows we found the pierced Messiah text, he told his accusers. Whether we interpreted it right or not isn't the point. Eisenman glared silently at a heckler in the audience and then continued as if nothing had happened. So we found the pierced Messiah text. Everybody knows that. We found the Messiah of heaven and earth text. I was the first one to publish the Coet text. We also found those extra passages in the Genesis Florigelium and reconstructed a beautiful text superior to the Oxford reconstruction of it. We have been finding these texts all along. We reconstructed a beautiful text called the Children of Yeshua, the Children of Salvation text. We found that marvelous masturbation text. We didn't need anyone's help in finding the 2 copies of the last column of the Damascus document, and we developed it with our own translation. Now I submit to you, if we could do all that, do you think we needed to rely on these people's work for these other things? I submit that we couldn't have needed to rely. We could do it ourselves. As far as I am aware, we did do it ourselves. Over and over in the coming year, I would hear from Eisenman his belief that the scholarly establishment was out to get him, out to destroy his credibility and the power of his ideas. He put it succinctly in his closing statement. Our past point is about whether this has to do with transcriptions or scholarship, or whether it has to do with an old establishment attempting to reassert control over the field again to go back to the old situation of official editions. Comparing the viciousness of the attacks against him to other cases of disputed authorship in scroll studies, he concluded that the animosity arose primarily against the new translations and the new interpretations, the new spin that we, Professor Weiss with his own hypothesis, and me with the Jewish Christian one, are giving these things. We got out there first with it, and that infuriates a lot of people. They feel that by discrediting us, they discredit our interpretations. I submit that it won't work. The game is up, Mr. Schiffman. Even though you have joined the official team, you remember what you were termed according to my view of you in the Vanity Fair article. And you told me you didn't know what a running dog was. In any case, I submit that the game is up, and there are no more official editions, no more teams. What we have is free competition and free thinking. Eisenman finally ended his passionate defense of the serious charges against him, and that's where we should have been in the first place. In the lobby of the auditorium on the opening day of the conference, I had approached Robert Eisenman directly. He was standing alone while the other scholars chatted in small groups. To tell you the truth, even though I had been impressed with his presentation and wanted to talk to him further, I felt uncomfortable as I stood with him in the small outer lobby, fearing that the more respectable scholars would assume that I had gone over to the enemy. I had learned all too well in earlier interviews of the depth and the breadth of the hostility to Eisenman. Bringing up his name without the requisite disavowal was usually regarded as a reason for suspicion or a symptom of emotional distress. Eisenman had been publicly accused of being just a minor scholar, which was little more than an expression of disdain for his scholarly affiliation, California State University at Long Beach. It was certainly not based on a serious evaluation of his ideas. The eloquence with which he had delivered his defense against the charges of plagiarism and his utter unconcern with currying other scholars' approval led me to see almost immediately that this was a personality I could not afford to neglect. So we struck up a conversation. We set a time to get together, and with the clear intimation that I should keep the meeting quiet, he handed me a card with the name and address of his West Side hotel. I had expected Eisenman to be relatively tight-lipped about his legal and professional problems, but he readily opened up the details of his earlier career to me. He had placed the 2 big volumes of unauthorized scroll photos on prominent display on the coffee table of his hotel suite. Utterly uncontrite and even proud of his role in breaking the scroll monopoly, he launched into a long autobiographical monologue. I had previously only known him from a distance, but now I got a glimpse of his personality as the younger brother of the internationally acclaimed architect Peter Eisenman, who had apparently always received far more attention than he. Intellectually, Robert Eisenman was hard to characterize. His Columbia Ph.D. was not in biblical literature or history, but in Islamic law. He had previously studied Hebrew and Near Eastern history at New York University, and after a period of postdoctoral study in Israel, he had become something of an academic jack of all trades. Yet there was something more than a younger son's craving for attention or the marginal scholar's self-promotion in his recounting of his own intellectual achievements and deepening interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls. As we walked out into the blustery December night and stopped for dinner at an ominously empty Indian restaurant on Columbus Avenue, Eisenman described the genesis of his unique scroll theories with angry clarity. His historical theories required a complete mental shift of gears. I had come to New York with the highest regard for the scholars that Eisenman had been relentlessly attacking, and had been convinced that Eisenman was nothing more than a troublemaking gadfly. Yet as we talked, I recognized how Eisenman honed in precisely on the dubious assumptions, shaky logic, simplistic readings of ancient sources, and pseudo-scientific dating methods for handwriting that supported the whole superstructure of Qumran research. In the face of professional ostracism, he had spoken with conviction, refusing to be humbled. He showed that he had not the slightest interest in stealing the work of others, and while others waffled or equivocated, he had maintained his integrity. Through the rest of the week, I sat impatiently and with increasing boredom listening to what the respectable scholars had to say. The same old arguments were put forward, placing the origin of the sect in the context of anti-Hasmonean protest and declaring that the Qumranic idea of the Messiah was quite different from that of Christianity, except for Eisenman's paper, which was greeted with titters, and Weiss's paper, which was overshadowed by his forced statement of contrition. Few of the papers addressed the scroll's significance for understanding first-century Judean society as it hurled towards its own apocalyptic war. And by the end of the conference, Eisenman's passionate conviction that our society's conventional ideas about the origins of Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism were fictional, self-serving fables, and that many of the most prominent scroll scholars were mere lackeys for the establishment finally began to make sense to me. In the chapters that follow, I will try to reconstruct the history of the Dead Sea Scroll interpretation and focus on the crucial moments when subtle preconceptions and conventional religious sensibilities, both Jewish and Christian, clouded the conclusions of mainstream scholarship. It is a story far more gripping than any Vatican conspiracy dreamed up by the tabloids, and far more enlightening than the rehash of conventional scholarship that is dished up, warmed over in the religion sections of Time and Newsweek, and in the science section of the New York Times. The study of the Dead Sea Scrolls is and has always been neither theology nor science, but an exercise in almost pure religious metaphor. One merely had to scan the audience of scholars assembled at the New York conference to see that there were virtually no sociologists, philosophers, or social critics among them. Their chief qualifications for heaping disdain upon Eisenman and his theories was their vastly superior skill at analyzing biblical Hebrew grammar or parsing Aramaic verbs. Certainly they could chastise Eisenman and Weiss for errors of transcription, and perhaps even for utilizing the literal decipherments of others. But what of the larger significance of those documents? What more did these respectable and respectful academics know of the rage of the apocalyptic outsiders who wrote the scrolls, who withdrew from a society that had betrayed them and spent the rest of their days dreaming and scheming in quiet anticipation of the divine wrath that would rain down upon their enemies at the end of days? The way in the wilderness has endured through the ages as a viable, if desperate, avenue of political action, appearing again and again as the central hope of the displaced, the dispossessed, the homeless, and those with nothing to lose. Through the ages, peasants have left the Lord and the manor to build new Jerusalems in the waste places. Pietists and refugees have abandoned all that is familiar. Crusaders, pioneers, and cultists have departed from lives of not-so-quiet desperation to conquer new worlds and construct for themselves their own city on the hill. Rarely have these exiles succeeded in their expectations, for the way in the wilderness must eventually lead to a fateful choice between submission or death. The frontier and desolate places chosen by such voluntary Exiles are sometimes the birthplace of powerful spiritual insights that precariously strike the balance between their violent, rage-filled nightmares and their utopian dreams. Those who withdraw from the society of power and greed and ambition see redemption as the result of righteousness and human effort. Yet the grim satisfaction of the utopian in seeing the left-behind world decay and crumble can never completely square itself with the innocent piety of communal greenhouses, workshops, and living quarters. They, too, represent a vestige of earthly order that must, by the heartless calculation of the apocalyptic, be destroyed. This paradox of construction and destruction, poised on the knife edge, is the heart of the message of the scrolls. Again and again, the overwhelming feelings of oppression imposed by arriving empires that change the order of life and culture and move people around like chess pieces brings forth those groups who will make a way for themselves in the wilderness. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the voice of some of those who would not submit to the inevitability of Roman power, and by extension, who would not submit to the system in which peoples were treated as objects, natural resources, or available draft animals, whose only value was to keep the empire's coffers full. As usual, great expense was lavished on the public monuments to the inevitability of this imperial order, and they are the monuments so beloved of tourists to Israel even today. At Caesarea by the sea, the seat of the governors of Palestine, a massive restoration project is underway to link the ancient amphitheater with the other ancient temples and warehouses of Herod's harbor. At Beth Shean, an ancient Scythopolis in the northern Jordan Valley, the columns and statues of the Forum are being erected once more at the behest of the Ministry of Tourism and the delight of the local labor exchange. And beneath the modern courtyards and villas of the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, the residences of the last high priest of Jerusalem have been lovingly restored to give visitors a glimpse of their splendor and elegance. But where are the archaeological monuments to the passion and rage of the national uprising against Romans? Where can one go in Israel to see the archaeological monuments that make some sense of the resentment of people whose way of life was disrupted by the sweeping changes in economy and culture, and by the accumulation of vast estates worked by tenant farmers and dedicated to the profit of others who reveled in the ways of Greece and Rome? Even the sites of Masada and the stronghold of Gamla, where the archaeologists have been able to pinpoint the grisly evidence of death and destruction that marked an end to the rebellion. The larger context for the sacred rage and willingness to fight the Romans to the death remains undiscovered. How do the pieces of the archaeological puzzle fit together? How can a connection be made between Gamla and the Romanized city of Sepphoris in the Galilee with its theater and wealthy residences, between Masada and its simple synagogue and Caesarea with its massive temple to the deified Emperor Augustus? This was more than pure religious conflict. It was the collision of two worlds. The Roman triumph over the Jewish rebels in 70 CE and again in 135 marked the permanent establishment of a system of exploitation which could not tolerate the existence of any group that would refuse to accept its logic or even its inevitability. Both Christianity and Judaism arose in this movement of triumph for the forces of Roman order, and we are today all heirs, for better or for worse, to the cultural surrender and spiritual accommodation that the establishment of those religions signified. Maybe we cannot see what went on in the Roman province of Judea because we live today in a world of ever-intensifying and expanding industrial development that ultimately cannot tolerate the existence of what we brand as primitive or backward without transforming it into a quaint curiosity or wiping it out. Both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity abandoned the violent passion of the earlier Messianic movements of Judea. They abandoned the hope that all must physically and completely separate themselves from the forces of darkness and await the coming judgment day. The scroll's visions, like those of latter-day apocalyptists, Jim Jones and David Koresh of Islamic Jihad and the West Bank Kahanists, can become pornographies of violence acted out with a horrifying relish for blood. Alternatively, these visions can become the starting point for more mystical hallucinations and otherworldly journeys away in the alienated wilderness of the psyche of the individual. In their unrelenting, apocalyptic message, the scrolls give a voice to a group that felt dispossessed and disenfranchised in a world turned upside down. They give voice to a rage against invaders and contempt for collaborators interested only in personal gain. They wrap their community in a defensive cocoon of national laws and traditions. They express the hope for a day when the upside-down world will be righted, when the wicked will suffer for their wickedness, and when the poor will be recognized as the elect of God. The way in the wilderness is a declaration of war against the settled order, a direct challenge to the powers that be. The struggle for Dead Sea Scrolls has stakes that are enormous. It can challenge some of our society's deepest and most cherished religious understandings. It calls into questions the right of academic specialists who set our society's intellectual agenda, and it proposes a disturbing and radical revision of our understanding of the history of both Judaism and Christianity. Yet for more than 45 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls have been fought over by many jealous claimants, each with a view of the text, historical or religious significance that they believed was the definitive one. This conflict of interpretations has fueled a bitter struggle for the exclusive intellectual control and physical possession, in which the scrolls have become little more than the stage props for the public disputes of opposing political and religious ideologies. Since their composition more than 2,000 years ago by the pious sons of Zadok, the scroll's message has been repeatedly twisted, reframed, and reinterpreted by others. And in that sense, the Dead Sea Scrolls have been stolen again and again. Chapter 2. Discovery at Qumran. There is something mysterious and a bit unsettling to outsiders about the hot and barren coast of the Dead Sea. Even in the winter, the midday heat there can be oppressive, and when the wind dies down, an unpleasant sulphurous smell from the Dead Sea's bitter waters hangs in the air. Away from the main road, the silence is eerie, with craggy brown limestone cliffs baking under a relentless sun and a brilliant cloudless sky. Down by the greasy gray water and the muddy black beaches, there is hardly a sign of any vegetation, except for the tough old thorns among the rocks and the thickets of reeds that clog the few fresh water springs. This is the surreal stage on which some of the most important scenes of the Dead Sea Scroll drama were enacted. From a single small cave in the cliffside came the first 7 ancient rolls of leather, preserved by this region's extraordinary aridity. At the foot of the cliffs, on the white chalk cliff overlooking the seashore, at a site called Qumran, the Dominican archaeologists uncovered what they believed to be the meeting rooms and workshops of the Essene settlement. And over the years, many other caves have been discovered in the vicinity of Qumran, containing the fragmentary remnants of the religious literature, rule books, psalms, and even prophetic interpretation of a group of radical, rage-filled Jews who awaited the arrival of the Anointed of God, precisely in the period and within hiking distance of the places where John the Baptist proclaimed the imminence of redemption, and of the city where Jesus of Nazareth preached to his disciples and was crucified. Though you can now drive to Qumran from Jerusalem in a rented car or cruise in air-conditioned tourist coach comfort, this region, with its salt-encrusted tablelands, flood-washed gullies, towering limestone cliffs, and dark, jagged caverns, has long been perceived by Western travelers, pilgrims, and explorers through the hazy lens of biblical myth. It was not far from here, according to the book of Genesis, that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were incinerated by fire and brimstone. Only a few miles to the north, according to the book of Joshua, the walls of Jericho supposedly toppled from the Israelites' loud trumpet blast as they began their campaign to drive out the Canaanites and conquer their promised land. And it was in this rugged region that David and his band of renegades escaped from the wrath of King Saul. The scrolls have absorbed some of this ore of legend over the years. The circumstances and even the date of the original discovery have become the subjects of colorful fables. That's why it's so important in any examination of the affair of the Dead Sea Scrolls to start at the beginning, at the moment of discovery, and while dismantling the tall tales of an innocent Bedouin boy, a Bethlehem shoemaker, and a Syrian archbishop may be simple, it is far more difficult to understand what really went on. Most of the traditional stories can be shown to be false, inaccurate, or outright deceptions. And when you peel back the layers of misrepresentation and cultural misunderstanding, you discover that the saga of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as conveyed to the public, consists, like the biblical stories themselves, of a small historical kernel and a heaping helping of self-serving ideology. For the sake of the historical record, and in the interest of showing how thoroughly the Dead Sea Scrolls story has been saturated with subtle political and religious messages, it is important to remember that the traditional version of the discovery is little more than an Arabian Nights fairy tale. The dates and even the main characters have been so stripped of their historical identities and context that they would not seem out of place in a bedtime storybook. I do not mean to single out any particular retelling of the discovery story, because all of the most widely read authors of the 1950s, Burroughs, Allegro, Millett, Cross, Wilson, and Yadin, betray in their narrative a subtle condescension toward both the intelligence and the motives of the Bedouin. As the standard story goes, a single Bedouin boy, sometimes two, was wandering with his mixed flock of sheep and goats some distance north of the freshwater spring of En Feshka. When noticing that one of the animals had strayed from the others, he idly tossed back a rock into the small opening of a nearby cave. Instead of the expected smack of the rock against rock, wrote the scholar Frank Moore Cross, with a vividness of prose that is conspicuously absent from his descriptions of the explorations of Western scholars, he heard a shattering sound. He was frightened and fled. Later, presumably when the fear of jinn or hyenas finally gave way to the lure of buried gold, he and his companion, Ahmed Muhammad, returned and crept into the cave and found decaying rolls of leather in one of a number of strange elongated jars embedded in the floor of the cave. This and the other stories go on to relate a comedy of errors, by which the ancient scrolls plucked from their ancient hiding place by the innocent shepherd finally made their way through a series of middlemen and shady antiquities dealers into the hands of competent archaeologists. Most of the major actors in the opening acts of the Dead Sea Scrolls drama are dead, so to find out anything novel, you have to rely on faded and often confused memories of aged priests, clerks, and scholars who have spent the last 45 years embellishing the importance of their peripheral roles. None of the actual discoverers is now living, and the way of life of the Ta'amura, usually pronounced Ta'amra, tribe is now almost totally changed. Nowadays, most of the Ta'amura have ended their wanderings and settled down in the clusters of low stone houses on the southeastern outskirts of Bethlehem. In the cruel, demeaning jibes of outsiders, it is often said that each of the larger houses in the Ta'amura neighborhood represents the proceeds from the sale of a scroll. But today, the days of scroll hunting are long over, and it is not easy for a stranger to pick out a Ta'amura man from the rest of the population in Bethlehem. While many of the Ta'amura women still wear traditional Bedouin dresses and appear at the weekly open-air market to sell fresh produce, the men of the tribe now work mostly in construction, local factories, and stores. Only a few tribal members still wander toward the Dead Sea with their sheep and goat herds. And as these few shepherds and their flocks walk along the side of the highway, sporadically whipped by the exhaust gust of the passing air-conditioned tour buses on the way to Masada or the health spas near En-Gedi, they represent the last vestiges of a lifestyle that had gone on here for hundreds of years. Despite the fact that many chroniclers, among them Burroughs, Millick, and Wilson, have placed the discovery of the first group of scrolls at Qumran in the spring or summer of 1947, the actual date was apparently several months before that. The seasonal movement of the Ta'amura tribe toward the Dead Sea region at that time were not haphazard but carefully synchronized with the needs of their flocks. In the summer dry season, they would pitch their camps on the outskirts of Bethlehem in the hill country, where they could sell mutton, wool, and milk to the townsmen and graze their flocks in the stubble of the newly harvested fields. In the winter, when the cold rains returned, members of the tribe would drive the flocks eastward down to the warmth of the Jordan Valley and the shores of the Dead Sea. Thus, it is probable that the discovery of the scrolls took place in the winter, or more precisely, November or December of 1946. And the discovery was not due to the miraculous luck of a single lonely Bedouin shepherd boy, but to the cooperation of the three Ta'amura cousins. Khalil, Musa, and Juma'az Muhammad Khalil were grown men, and Muhammad Ahmed El-Hamid, who went by the colorful nickname Edid Dahib, the Wolf, was still a teenager. According to repeated interviews conducted by the American scholar John Trevor in the early 1960s, the three had gone down to the Dead Sea shore with their flocks, and while wandering with the sheep and goats along the foot of the steep limestone ridges, Juma'az Muhammad noticed a small opening in the cliff face, tossed in a stone, and heard the sound of breaking pottery. This was not the act of a bored shepherd, but of an experienced hunter for antiquities. Juma'az, like many other members of his tribe, knew exactly what he was looking for when it came to ancient artifacts, long before the winter of 1946. Even a quick glance at the reports of the early archaeologists working in this region shows that the name of the Ta'amura comes up again and again. Over the years, the Ta'amura have proved far more skillful, thorough, and daring in finding ancient artifacts in the ravines and caves of the Dead Sea region than the Western archaeologists, who lived, and still live, with the conceit that their motives are somehow more idealistic and less self-serving than those of the Bedouin. So as far as archaeology was concerned, the Ta'amura were, by the late 1940s, not scavengers but entrepreneurs. As early as the 1930s, the Ta'amura had begun to offer for sale ancient coins and pottery to the Jewish workers at the potash plant at the northern end of the Dead Sea. For a few more piastres, they were willing to take the Jewish workers to see caves that contained books from the time of your kings. That second offer was never accepted as far as I know. Archaeological artifacts had clearly become, for the Ta'amura, a welcome new source of sustenance in otherwise barren territory. Some of the tribe members also worked as hired laborers for the French consul and noted prehistorian René Neuville in his explorations of the caves of Wadi Karatum, southeast Bethlehem. And because Neuville was always ready to purchase artifacts that the Ta'amura had found at other locations, they began applying fairly systematic techniques of excavation for their own benefit. Techniques not far below the technical standards of some of the university-trained archaeologists of those days. In at least one case of enterprising excavation, a group of the Ta'amura had carefully removed the earth from a cave layer by layer, with one of the diggers maintaining a notebook with records of which soil layers contain the richest concentrations of artifacts. Thus, when Juma'az heard the sound of breaking pottery in the cave to the north of Ain Feshkaha, he probably had a fairly good idea of what he had found. But by the time he had summoned his cousins to help boost him up to the high, narrow cave entrance, darkness was falling. And the next day, the three men had to leave the immediate area to water their flocks at the spring of Ain Feshkaha, about 2 miles to the south. It was only 2 days later that one of the three, the teenager, Mohammed Edhi Dahib, returned to the cave and found not the usual small pottery vessels, but a number of tall jars with covers. He opened at least 2 of them and took out 3 brittle leather rolls, some of them wrapped in linen, which scholars would later identify as the Habakkuk Commentary, the Community Rule, and the Great Isaiah Scroll. According to their later recollections, Jumas and Khalil's Musa were angry at Endahib for going back to the cave without them, and they claimed the scrolls for themselves. They also recalled
that they stashed the manuscripts away in a sack and left it hanging on a tent pole in the Ta'amara camp for several weeks. But Juma and Khalil's clearly considered these scrolls to be worth something. Had they been as bumpkinish as they are usually depicted, they would simply have thrown the dirty old scrolls away. But on their next trip to Bethlehem, they brought the scrolls to Ibrahim Ija, a carpenter and woodworker who occasionally dealt in antiquities. While it is easy enough to flatter ourselves that the value of the scrolls should have been evident to any well-educated person, Ija was justifiably skeptical about the find. The fact that even later, after the scrolls were shown to several supposed experts, they were dismissed as either tattered modern Torah scrolls or worthless forgeries. These manuscripts were not, after all, the usual saleable oil lamp jars, coins, or jewelry that found a ready market among the pilgrims and tourists who came to visit the Church of the Nativity. Besides, they were written in Hebrew, and tensions in Palestine between Arabs and Jews were rising. When Ija brought the Bedouin scrolls for an appraisal by one of the Bethlehem's most experienced antiquities dealers, Fedai al-Alami, he received a stern warning that the Bedouin had probably stolen them from a synagogue and that he had better get rid of them before he got into serious trouble with the authorities. That, too, could have been the end of the matter. But when Jumas came back to Ija's shop about a month later, in April, he retrieved the unwanted scrolls indignantly, dismissed the frightened shopkeeper's warning, and made his way to Bethlehem's open-air marketplace. That Bethlehem market is even today still bustling with local shoppers. Its merchandise varies widely from old furniture and appliances to old clothing, squawking chickens, and fresh vegetables. And on that particular day in April 1947, the market also featured 3 of the original Dead Sea Scrolls. The next walk on part in the ongoing drama was played by a man named George Isaiah, Shea, as he was known in Arabic, who would prove to be as important a figure in the story as any Harvard professor or Israeli general. Shea, a member of the Syrian Orthodox community of Jerusalem, made his living selling shoes, cloaks, and other dry goods to the Ta'amara and the other Bedouin tribes in the Bethlehem area. In the marketplace, Shaya met Jumas, with whom he had done business, and he learned of Juma'ah's discovery. Shaya, too, was convinced that the scrolls might be worth something, and he persuaded Juma to go with him to the shop of another member of the Syrian Orthodox community, a cobbler named Khalil Iskander Shaheen, whom everyone knew simply as Kando. It is another common misconception that the Bedouin brought the scrolls to Kando because they stupidly assumed that the leather rolls might be useful to a cobbler as raw material for insoles or sandal straps. That is just another Dead Sea Scrolls fable, for anyone who has seen the scrolls or read the early descriptions of their brittleness must know that this is a ridiculous claim. Kando, though uncertain of the scroll's value, was willing to take a calculated business risk, and he would grow rich beyond his wildest dreams on account of that decision. Proposing to act as an agent for a 33% commission, Kando took the scrolls and gave Jumaaz and Musa Khalil a cash advance of 5 Palestine pounds, about $20, as a sign of good faith. Kando had an idea of someone who might be interested, Mar Athanasius Yeshu Samuel, the Jerusalem Syrian Orthodox community's bright, ambitious, and charismatic 40-year-old archbishop who was fascinated by ancient manuscripts. It is important to stress that this was not the first time that such documents were discovered, even from caves in the immediate region of the Dead Sea shore. I have already mentioned the rumored discoveries of ancient books by the Ta'amura Bedouin as early as the 1930s. But the recorded discoveries of the ancient documents in this region go back many centuries before that. The church father and biblical scholar Origen, who visited Palestine in the early 3rd century CE, reported the discovery of an ancient manuscript together with other Hebrew and Greek books in a jar near Jericho. Some 600 years later, around 800, Timotheus, the Nestorian patriarch of Seleucia, reported even more details about a subsequent manuscript discovery, the circumstances of which uncannily foreshadow those of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have learned from trustworthy Jews, wrote Timotheus to a friend and colleague, Sergius, the Archbishop of Elam in Mesopotamia, that some books were found some years ago in a rock dwelling near Jericho. The story was that a dog belonging to an Arab out hunting, while following game, went into the cave and did not come out again. Its owner went after it and found a chamber in the rock containing many books. The hunter went off to Jerusalem and told his story to the Jews, who came out in great numbers and found books of the Old Testament. And others in Hebrew script. And since there was a scholar well-read in literature among them, I asked him about many passages quoted in our New Testament as coming from the Old Testament, but found nowhere in it, neither in copies amongst the Jews nor in those amongst Christians. He said they are there and can be found in the books discovered there. That was an astounding suggestion, that there had been in antiquity a Hebrew scriptural tradition quite different from that of the canonical Old Testament. From the next century, around 950 CE, came more information about newfound manuscripts. Yaqub el-Khwarizmi, a historian of the breakaway Jewish sect of the Karaites, briefly described the doctrines of a Jewish group he called the Magharaya, the cave people, because their doctrines, which he described between his accounts of the beliefs of the Sadducees and the early Christians, were contained in ancient books that they had hidden in a cave. But the discoveries apparently stopped sometime in the Middle Ages. By the 19th century, all knowledge that the caves of that hot and forbidding area contained ancient manuscripts was lost to all, except perhaps to local Bedouin. If the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls would prove in some respects to be a comedy of errors, the Shapira affair was a tragedy. In 1882, a Jerusalem antiquities dealer named Moses Wilhelm Shapiro appeared suddenly and proudly in London, claiming that he had come into possession of ancient manuscript fragments from the book of Deuteronomy that had been found in a cave by Bedouin near the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. While the British Museum initially agreed to purchase the world's oldest Bible for the astounding sum of £1 million sterling, Shapira's Deuteronomy fragments were eventually branded as cunning forgeries and completely discredited. In the face of the public humiliation, Moses Shapira committed suicide. Today, when you walk along Christian Street in the old city of Jerusalem, through the hanging forest of Bedouin dresses, keffiyehs, and t-shirts, past the stacked pyramids of enameled metal ashtrays and mass-produced pottery, it is not easy to find the small shop, really just a two-room cell overlooking the pool of Hezekiah, from which Shapira sold fine antiquities to both museums and wealthy tourists, and which became a shuttered, notorious landmark after his death. The story of his discovery of the ancient manuscripts rings strangely true in light of the later Dead Sea Scrolls story, which of course was not to occur for another 64 years. According to Shapira's published accounts, he was informed that a Bedouin had by chance discovered blackened strips of parchment wrapped in cloth when he happened to take shelter in a cave near the outlet of the Wadi Mojib on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. Shapira was clearly intrigued by the story, and in the course of a series of secret meetings with the Bedouin, he purchased 15 of the manuscript fragments. The text they bore was a previously unknown version of the last speech of Moses on Mount Nebo, and a variant from the Ten Commandments. They differed dramatically from the canonical version in the book of Deuteronomy, in that they were shortened, rearranged, and interwoven with quotations from other biblical books. To be honest, there is much that is still mysterious about Shapira's manuscript fragments. Their whereabouts today are unknown. Some accounts say they were destroyed in a fire in the home of a collector who had acquired them, and the photographs taken at the time show only black leather with no letters visible. A drawing of the text made at the British Museum shows archaic Hebrew characters that look like they had been haltingly copied from a stone-carved inscription rather than flowing from a scribe's experienced pen. However, that might have more to do with the draftspersons at the British Museum, for in the 1880s, the collections were filled with some inscriptions and no truly ancient Hebrew manuscripts were known. And the fact was that Shapira had been involved in the sale of forgeries before. But what was really at stake in the whole Shapira affair went far beyond mere paleography or the suspicion of a Jewish antiquities dealer's motives. The idea that the text of the Bible was fluid and not based directly and unerringly on God's revelation was an insult to many scholars' deepest religious faith. Although it is perfectly clear that Shapira's manuscripts were not as old as he claimed them to be, around 850 BCE, was the date that he estimated. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has, as we shall see, allowed another possibility to surface. The use of archaic Hebrew letters came to be a form of patriotic expression at the time of the Maccabean kings, and later during the Jewish revolts against Rome, and at the same time there was a wide range of religious literature circulating among the Jewish population, in which a free rewriting of the Bible was regarded as a sign of divine revelation, not heresy. But all these insights lay far in the future, and before the deal with the British Museum could be consummated, Shapira was condemned by an imperious French scholar named Charles Clermont-Ganneau, and soon branded as nothing more than a sly Jew in the popular press. For him the shame was unbearable, and driven to destitution in an unsuccessful campaign to prove that the scroll fragments were genuine, he took his own life. That is an act that seems out of character for a schemer just out for money and fame. Had poor Shapira lived in the 20th century, his fate might have been different. But then, who can be sure? When Archbishop Samuel offered his scrolls for inspection to the scholars and experts, several of them warned him that his documents were probably forgeries, and that the whole matter could turn out to be just another Shapira affair. Yet the intellectual atmosphere and political context of this manuscript discovery was very different from that of the 19th century. The reality of the textual evolution had caught on in biblical studies. Scholars paid as much attention to the details of letter forms as they did to the literary contents. And most important of all, the political situation in Palestine was moving towards a situation where tangible mementos of the Jewish past would possess a powerful emotional impact. Whether Shapira's earlier discoveries were genuine is not the real question. The real question is, would the Dead Sea Scrolls, found by the Bedouin and purchased by Archbishop Samuel, ever have come to the world's attention if the imperious skepticism of the early scholars had prevailed? Like every other part of the landscape of the Dead Sea Scrolls story, the appearance of St. Mark's Monastery in the old city of Jerusalem has been changed by time, war, and urban development. But it is still possible to follow the path that Kando and George Shaya took to show the scrolls to Archbishop Samuel. Winding your way down a narrow, stepped street in the Armenian quarter in the direction of the Jewish quarter, you finally reach a sharp leftward angle where, tucked inconspicuously into the corner, is a medieval stone gateway surmounted by a garish, modern mosaic of St. Mark. The electric doorbell beside the heavy metal door summons one of the deacons, who opens the door slowly and suspiciously. Few tourists now come to visit the church, the library, or even the underground room, which Syrian tradition believes was the scene of the Last Supper. For the congregation of St. Mark's is the last bastion of a dwindling community that finds itself surrounded and besieged by strangers on all sides. The living quarters for the priest and the residence of the archbishop are located up a steep stairway from the entrance courtyard. The church sanctuary, with its icons, elaborate altarpiece, and ancient Syriac inscriptions, is directly ahead. There are today few parishioners to share in the worship since 1948. Most of the Jerusalem Syrian Orthodox community has gone off to find new homes and livelihoods in Canada and the United States. Yet St. Mark's continued existence, though flickering like the candles on the altar, represent a living link to the earliest days of Christianity. Not only is the church built on one of the traditional sites of the Last Supper, and possibly also of the meeting place of the Council of Jerusalem, presided over by James the Just, the brother of Jesus, but the Syrian Orthodox community itself traces its origins back to the original Christian community founded in Antioch by St. Paul. The complex 5th century CE theological disputes about the human and divine nature of the person of Christ that led to the eventual succession of the Syrian Orthodox Church from the Byzantine Church in the 6th century under Jacob Barradius are convoluted and hard to follow for outsiders. Suffice it to say that the Syrians have always considered themselves to be the only true keepers of the Christian flame. The language of their liturgy is Syriac, a form of Aramaic that is probably close to that spoken by the Jesus and the disciples, and the Syrian Orthodox priesthood prides itself in erudition when it comes to the subtleties of ancient doctrine as revealed in each monastery's large collection of ancient Syriac manuscripts. Though we have become used to equating sound scholarship with accredited universities and formalized doctoral dissertations, there is no reason naturally to assume that some junior professor in a department of religion is fundamentally more perceptive about ancient texts than a bright young Syrian Orthodox priest. Athanasius Yeshu Samuel, who had come to Jerusalem as a child with his mother from northern Syria in 1920, was one such priestly scholar. Soon after entering the church, he was assigned to the library at St. Mark's, and his skill in handling, reading, and identifying ancient documents was so good that in 1939 he was dispatched by his archbishop to accompany an English scholar, Boyd Alexander, in search of ancient Syriac manuscripts in the library of St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. So there is no reason to portray Samuel, as some popular accounts of the scroll story attempt to, as a sly and calculating figure interested only in the money he believed the scrolls would bring. Though appointed Syrian Archbishop of Jerusalem at the relatively young age of 40 in the previous December, and saddled with many new responsibilities, Archbishop Samuel, with his raven black beard and his infectious enthusiasm, was honestly fascinated by the scrolls of inscribed leather that his parishioners, Kando and George Shaya, brought him soon after Holy Week 1947. Immediately noting that the parchment of the scrolls was far more brittle than that of even the oldest New Testament manuscripts in the library, Samuel made an intuitive calculation that proved to be surprisingly accurate. Samuel's decision to buy the documents was made almost immediately, but the purchase was not finalized until midsummer. After long and complex negotiations directed by Kando for his Bedouin clients, not that the agreed sum was by any means enormous, Samuel agreed to purchase the scrolls for 24 Palestinian pounds, then approximately equivalent to $100. Kando then gave 2/3 of the proceeds to Juma'az and Khalil Musa. He kept the equivalent out of about $35 for himself. Today, Archbishop Samuel no longer ministers to the dwindling flock at St. Mark's Monastery. Now in his mid-80s, he lives in a comfortable split-level ranch house on a quiet suburban street in Lodi, New Jersey, and serves, as he has since 1949, as the primate of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Canada and the United States. Though his famous beard is now white and his movements are slow and deliberate, he still wears the archbishop's robes and heavy golden cross so familiar from the early photos, and he is still as loquacious as ever about the scrolls. I went to see him for the first time the day after Christmas 1991, and he greeted me with a broad smile and a firm handshake. With his housekeeper already boiling Turkish coffee in the kitchen, Archbishop Samuel invited me into the living room where he had set out some scroll memorabilia on a low table, a large photo facsimile of the great Isaiah scroll, and a few genuine scroll fragments he still possessed. I had a long list of questions that I wanted to ask him about Kando, the Bedouin, the discovery, but the Archbishop had a question he wanted to ask me first. "Did you see the Nova?" he asked me, referring to the recent episode of the PBS Science series that highlighted the conflict over the Dead Sea Scrolls. In addition to an opening montage of old photos that told the story of the scrolls' early wanderings, the documentary featured extensive interviews with the current disputants in the scrolls controversy, including Herschel Shanks, Larry Schiffman, and Norman Gold. "I saw it also," the Archbishop said, with a weak smile, trying to hide his embarrassment. "I made a copy of it. They wrote me letter. They said when we were making the film, we didn't know how to locate you, and now we located you, but it's too late. The film is ready. So I watched it," he continued, "and saw myself and how young I was at the time. How many years ago was it?" He paused to make a silent calculation. "Yes, it's been 44 years. The irony of the Archbishop's latter-day snubbing is that the scholars who now so eagerly jostle for position to give on-camera interviews about the importance of the scrolls bear an uncanny resemblance to those scholars who had only disdain for Archbishop Samuel and his crazy ideas in the summer of 1947. Once again, as was the case with the standard stories about ignorant Bedouin, the storybook buffoon turns out to be the story's real hero, for despite all their explanations, equivocations, and rationalizations, most of the scholars on the scene, even those who supposedly specialized in the study of ancient manuscripts, simply got it wrong. Samuel first turned for a professional opinion to Stephen Hanna-Stephan, a St. Mark's parishioner who served as assistant librarian in the Palestinian Archaeological Museum. Stephan, whom acquaintances remember as a sour-faced little man with a bad disposition, looked over the leather scrolls and declared them to be modern forgeries. A Dutch priest, J.P.M. van der Ploeg, who was in Jerusalem for a year of study and who had often visited the library of St. Mark's, identified the largest of Samuel's scrolls as a copy of the book of Isaiah. Another seemed to him to be a collection of prophetic quotations, but he was not willing to vouch for their antiquity. In August of the same year, two experts from the Hebrew University Library came to see the scrolls and mistakenly identified them as medieval, unusual and perhaps worthy of study, but not earth-shaking by any means. As a last resort, Samuel brought the scrolls in the early autumn of 1947 to his ecclesiastical superior, Patriarch Ignatius Ephraim, in the northern Syrian city of Homs. And even though the patriarch advised Samuel to forget the whole matter, the young archbishop persisted, fully convinced of the value of the scrolls. In October, Dr. Tuvia Weschler of Hebrew University, who identified yet again the large scroll as the book of Isaiah, tried to convince the archbishop of the absurdity of his claims for the antiquity of these things. Weschler's words were right on the mark, though he certainly didn't intend them that way. If the table were a box, he said, pointing to the surface where the archbishop's scrolls were displayed, and you filled it full of pound notes, you couldn't even measure the value of the scrolls, if they are 2,000 years old, as you say. The truth was apparently beyond the comprehension of the established scholars. It was only the Syrian Orthodox Archbishop Athanasius Yeshu Samuel who had the imagination to see. Other doubters would come forward in later years to claim that the scrolls were not nearly as important as some people said, but Archbishop Samuel has always been faithful. I knew that they were ancient. He told me himself as he leaned forward in his easy chair in the living room in Lodi. I knew that it wasn't a lie. The Dead Sea Scrolls in their Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum are today as much a political symbol as Rome's Colosseum or Philadelphia's Liberty Bell. For in the state of Israel, the drama of their discovery has always been juxtaposed in metaphorical terms with the founding of the Jewish state. Despite the heretical anti-authoritarian message that runs through the Qumran literature, the building that houses the scrolls is an example of an establishment institution, part of the landscape of power in Western Jerusalem. As you stand in the plaza of the Shrine of the Book, you can hardly avoid noticing the modernistic structure that houses the Knesset, and beyond it, the office buildings for the various government ministries. That juxtaposition of past and present, of temporal power, ancient manuscripts, and spiritual message is certainly not coincidental. For during the last 45 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls have acquired a certain sanctity in Israel, and the Shrine of the Book has become a chapel of relics dedicated to the miracle of national rebirth. How that happened is due to something of a comedy of errors. For by the autumn of 1947, there were two rival groups of ancient manuscripts circulating in Jerusalem. Juma'ah's discovery in the cave near Qumran was to be just the beginning, for once Archbishop Samuel had expressed his interest in buying the scrolls, Kando sought additional merchandise. Sometime in the spring or early summer of 1947, he dispatched George Shaya on an expedition, accompanied by Juma'az and Khalil Musa, to find the original cave. The journey of the two Bedouin and the Syrian dry goods peddler down to the Dead Sea in a hired taxi must have been hilarious, though certainly not to the participants. You can almost imagine the angry, uncomfortable taxi driver sitting impatiently behind the wheel of his car parked by the side of the road, cursing and sweating in the sweltering heat, while his three passengers got out and hiked their way up to the cave. Yet the haul proved to be worth the effort. George Shaya and Khalil Musa dug away the dirt on the floor of the dark and stuffy cave amid shattered jars and hundreds of parchment fragments to retrieve 4 more documents. In contrast to the other group, then still in the hands of Kando, 3 of the 4 were in relatively poor condition. 2 of them were crumpled and matted rather than rolled, and 1 had a damp gooey and obviously in an advanced state of decay. By now, however, the antiquities grapevine had been apparently humming around Bethlehem, and there was considerable interest in the scrolls. Returning from the Dead Sea, Shaya took one of the scrolls for his share in the renewed expedition. It was the gooey one, later to be identified as the Genesis Apocryphon, and would eventually be sold with the first group to Archbishop Samuel. Juma'az and Khalil Musa, for their part, apparently found a new and more lucrative outlet. They sold the other three scrolls to the dealer Fede al-Alami, who had now become convinced of the possible value of ancient scrolls. Rarely have national treasures been sold at such bargain basement prices. Al-Alami paid £7, not quite $30, for the three documents that turned out to be the scroll of the war of the Sons of Light against Darkness, the Thanksgiving hymns, and another Isaiah scroll. In addition, he purchased the 2 tall jars in which the scrolls had been hidden for about 75 cents apiece. Hoping to get a big city price for these acquisitions, Al-Alami contacted an associate in Jerusalem, an American named Nazri Ohan, who had an antiquity shop in the Christian Quarter opposite the Lutheran Church. Now this is how that connection to Israel was made, for Ohan had for years done business with Professor Elazar Sukenik of the Hebrew University, and when the matter came to Hebrew manuscripts, Ohan gave Sukenik a call. And unlike the scholars consulted by Archbishop Samuel, Sukenik recognized immediately from the fragments that Ohan showed him that the scrolls were of unimaginable importance, and he quickly made arrangements to buy them from Fede al-Alami. Sukenik was not a conventional scholar, largely self-taught. He had only 2 years of formal university training. His greatest talent was being in the right place at the right time.
Just a quick note, Ohan was Armenian. That was Armenian, not an American.
A dedicated Zionist, he had made a conscious decision years before to make his fame promoting Jewish archaeology. His achievements in that field were numerous. He had excavated a significant number of ancient synagogues and tombs. But one particular area of expertise enabled him to recognize the scroll's value. In excavating and studying dozens of inscribed stone ossuaries in which the bones of the Jewish inhabitants of the first centuries BCE and CE were deposited, he was well aware of the distinctive Hebrew letter forms of that period. The letters on the scrolls were strikingly similar, and while Archbishop Samuel had only an intuitive feeling about their proper dating, Sukenik could rely on demonstrable archaeological facts. The story of Sukenik's trip on an Arab bus with Ohan to Al-Alami's house in Bethlehem is usually described as a dangerous mission, for the date of the journey was November 29, 1947, the day that the United Nations General Assembly voted to partition Palestine. Certainly in light of the bloody violence that was to erupt between Jews and Arabs in the months that followed, Sukenik's decision to go to the Arab town of Bethlehem, taken against the advice and warnings of his wife and son Yigal Yadin, who was then serving as a chief of operations for the Haganah, has to be admired as a sign of his conviction about the value of the scrolls. That night, Sukenik returned home with 2 scrolls, the War Scroll and the Thanksgiving hymns, and the 2 jars taken from the cave. About a month later, he was able to acquire the poorly preserved Isaiah scroll, sharing news of his great discovery with President Judah Magnes of the Hebrew University, Sukenik gained an important ally. Magnes was so impressed with the discovery of ancient Hebrew writings from the Second Temple period that he provided £200 from university funds for the purchase of the manuscripts. That sum was still quite modest, but it was an indication that the going price for the scrolls was clearly on the rise. At this time, Sukenik knew nothing of Archbishop Samuel's manuscripts, but by late January 1948, Samuel was getting discouraged by his own prospects, since he had so far found no one who believed in the antiquity of the scrolls. Among the Archbishop's closest advisors, Anton Kiras, who had driven him to Syria in the previous autumn, now suggested Sukenik as a potential buyer for the scrolls. Back in 1945, Professor Sukenik had excavated an ancient tomb on Kerez's property. Perhaps the professor would be interested in examining the Archbishop's discovery. A meeting was arranged at the Jerusalem YMCA, and Sukenik immediately saw that Samuel's 4 scrolls were in even better condition than his own. Seeking time to study them further and perhaps to confer with some colleagues, Sukenik received Kerez's permission to keep them for a few days. Had life in Jerusalem been normal, there is no question that Sukenik could have easily raised the unprecedented sum to purchase these scrolls on behalf of Hebrew University. But at this time, when both Arab and Jewish inhabitants of the city were beginning to fear for their very existence, and the overland links between Jewish Jerusalem and the outside world were being slowly cut off, money to purchase antiquities was understandably difficult to raise. Yet that was not the real reason for the termination of contacts between Sukenik and Samuel and the return of the borrowed scrolls to him. Another of Samuel's close friends and advisors, Brother Boutros Salmi of St. Mark's, warned the Archbishop that in light of the increasingly violent conditions in Jerusalem, he should avoid further dangerous contact with the Jewish professor and take the scrolls for an evaluation to the more neutral American schools of Oriental research. Nothing in the further history of the scrolls story contradicts Mark Twain's assertion that Americans have always been the most credulous Holy Land pilgrims, bringing with them the innocent arrogance of prime and proper Protestant missionaries. In the war-torn academic year of 1947 and 48, there were only 2 students at the American school in Jerusalem, John Trevor and William Brownlee, both of them earnest Midwesterners who had come to pursue their biblical studies with perhaps less intellectual brilliance than abundant Sunday school faith. The school's annual professor, Dr. Miller Burroughs of the Yale Divinity School, was away on a trip to Baghdad when Brother Salmi and Archbishop Samuel came calling, and John Trevor was the only one there to welcome them. Trevor had 2 things going for him. Professor Frank Moore-Cross of Harvard recalled. One was naivety. He wasn't used to seeing forgeries. He hadn't been in that part of the world very long. Most of all, he was a very impressive photographer. The combination was providential. It was providential because Trevor and then Brownlee, who returned to the school from an errand to the post office, became convinced that the Archbishop's scrolls were really quite ancient once they had leafed through some books in the library about the development of Hebrew scripts. At once, Trevor set to work with the Archbishop's permission, photographing the documents in the basement of the school. The film was expired. The conditions were difficult, but Trevor managed to take the clearest color photos ever made of the great Isaiah scroll, the Manual of Discipline, and the commentary on Habakkuk, all of which Trevor and Brownlee managed to identify and study at least briefly after the return of Professor Burroughs from Iraq. Trevor also had the presence of mind to send a few copies of his photos to Professor William Foxwell. Albright at Johns Hopkins, the undisputed doyen of American Biblical Archaeology. Albright responded immediately and enthusiastically to the American scholars. My heartiest congratulations on the greatest MS discovery of modern times. With the violence intensifying every day in Jerusalem as the weeks ticked towards May 15th and the end of the British Mandate, Burroughs, Trevor, and Brownlee made preparations to return to the United States. But before they did, they managed to persuade Archbishop Samuel to sign an agreement guaranteeing that the American schools of Oriental research the exclusive right to publish photographs of the scrolls. Burroughs also apparently made some unofficial assurances that he would help the Archbishop find a suitable buyer or institution to house the scrolls and support the work of his church. With seductive visions of prosperity and acclaim in American dancing before him, Samuel agreed to the warm scholarly embrace of Burroughs, Trevor, and Brownlee. An appropriate press release was drafted and sent off to the ASOR headquarters in New Haven. And on April 11, 1948, the existence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the oldest biblical text ever discovered, was revealed to the world. When Professor Elazar Sukenik, on the western side of embattled Jerusalem, was shown the American statement, he exploded with anger. He suspected that his abortive negotiations with Anton Kiras had been sabotaged by the Americans. Sukenik's furious letters to America and his frantic attempts to enlist the aid of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion in declaring that the Archbishop's scrolls should be the rightful property of the newly established State of Israel achieved no results, however. At the time of war, other priorities took precedence. The Archbishop Samuel himself had, in the meantime, left Jerusalem with the scrolls. The details of his understanding with the Americans were probably never set down in writing, but it is clear that he saw that his future lay in the United States. Appointed apostolic delegate of North America by Patriarch Ignatius Afram, he arrived in New York in January 1949 with two clear objectives: to expand the activities of the Syrian Orthodox Church in the New World and to make the most of his scrolls. Trevor and Burroughs hurried to New York to meet him, and over the next 2 years they accompanied Samuel to highly publicized exhibitions of the scrolls at the Library of Congress, the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore, the University of Chicago, and Duke University. In 1950, the first of the promised ASOR publications appeared with a volume containing Trevor's photographs of the Isaiah scroll. In the next year came a full publication of the Manual of Discipline and the Habakkuk commentary. Sukenik, for his part, also put a series of reports both on the three scrolls that he had purchased from Fedi al-Alami and of the brief transcriptions he had made of portions of the Archbishop's scrolls during the few days they were in his hands. Ordinarily, this would have been seen as a crude breach of scholarly etiquette. The unauthorized publication of a manuscript being studied by somebody else. In fact, a similar event, but 40 years later, would become the essence of the scrolls controversy. But Sukenik was truly convinced that he had made a gentleman's agreement with Anton Kurez and that all the scrolls rightfully belonged to him. Sukenik made that position clear in a face-to-face meeting with John Trevor in New York City in the spring of 1949. Trevor, who is now retired with his wife in Southern California, remembered this meeting vividly when I spoke to him in the summer of 1993. The meeting began quite cordially, Trevor recalled, but slowly the passion mounted as Sukenik listened to John Trevor's pride in having discovered the scrolls. Trevor was at the time working for an international council of religious education, traveling around the country promoting the new revised standard version of the Bible. And it is not difficult to imagine how Sukenik quickly became impatient with Trevor's polite conversation about Christian youth groups and Sunday schools. This young American, with only the most rudimentary knowledge of Jewish history, was now standing in the way of Sukenik's obtaining what he believed was a precious national heritage. To this day, Trevor recalls the unpleasant climax of the meeting with the innocent lack of understanding. He just blew up at me after he had been very polite for quite a while, Trevor told me. I could see the tension building up, and then he said, "You had no right to get involved in any of this." Elazar Sukenik died in 1953 and did not live to win the battle for the scrolls, but they would all eventually be untied in Israel, Jerusalem. The reason was that by the time of Sukenik's death, Archbishop Samuel had recognized the emptiness of Professor Burroughs' promises and the utter inability of John Trevor, despite all his noble intentions, to do anything for him. For once the scrolls had been published and the scholarly laurels had been obtained by the Americans, it was far more difficult to find a buyer for the scrolls. Sukenik, of course, had kept up a steady stream of lawsuits against the potential purchaser. And in the meantime, the government of Jordan, now in occupation of the Qumran region, joined the angry claimants. Needless to say, Archbishop Samuel was getting desperate. He had gambled his future on the scrolls. By the spring of 1954, he was ready to try almost anything, and following the advice of his closest American confidant, a successful wholesale plumbing distributor named Charles Manoog, he placed a fairly inconspicuous announcement in the classified advertising section of the Wall Street Journal on June 1st, 1954. The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Box F 206, The Wall Street Journal. The idea that the scrolls would be merchandised like apartments for rent or used machinery always gets a laugh when the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is presented. But the fact is, that ad in the Wall Street Journal led directly to the sale of the scrolls. By yet another twist of fate, General Yigal Yadin, former Israeli chief of staff and son of Professor Sukenik, who had just completed his doctoral dissertation on the scroll of the war of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, was in New York on a lecture tour just at the time. Alerted to the Wall Street Journal ad by an acquaintance, he set to work with the help of the Israeli Consul General in New York, Abraham Harman, to open anonymous negotiations for the purchase of the scroll through middlemen. A price was duly arrived at $250,000 for all 4 scrolls, and Archbishop Samuel and Charles Manook drove into Manhattan with the ancient documents. After the scrolls were inspected and certified to be authentic by Dr. Harry Orlinsky, the contract was signed and the money was transferred. Yadin eventually gained the financial support of the New York industrialist and philanthropist D. Samuel Gartzman to unwrite the purchase, but the subsequent shipment of the scrolls to Israel was to be kept a secret, at least initially. But Yadin could not restrain his excitement. On the afternoon of July 4th, 1954, he telephoned Professor Albright at Johns Hopkins. Albright immediately dashed off a letter of congratulations. How happy your father would be at this development, since all his efforts were unsuccessful. These priceless documents belong at the Hebrew University, with the other scrolls from Qumran.